Hey guys, Greg with GM Russell Photography here. I went out this morning to a town nearby where I live called Hamilton. It's about 30 minutes away. And I just wanted to get a photo of this bridge. I know it's not the most enticing scene with a couple houses behind it, but I knew I could do a long exposure here, and I knew that I would likely get some of the sunrise that came out this morning. So I'm going to go through my Lightroom here a little bit and show you guys kind of where I started. I always take a few shots without a long exposure beforehand just to get a feel for what I'm looking at, and also to use as a reference in case I want to, show somebody what it looks like before the long exposure and after. So you can see here that I've captured the water pretty, it's pretty caught in time, right? Like frozen in time, like you would expect a non-long exposure photo to be. And you can see that this sky right here is maybe a little blown out behind the bridge, but that's also why we take some test shots, right? So you can kind of see the difference there. And of course, we can always bring up the shadows here if we wanted to. But you can see kind of the difference here between the first long exposure before I put my neutral density filter on and the normal shot. So without the long exposure, we have this. And then going into the long exposure, we have this. And you can see probably why I think that is much nicer. It's a lot more appealing, isn't it? Having that motion going through the water like that. So yeah, I'm going to go through here a little bit and just see where I like my composition. I changed it up a couple of times. So I got in kind of tight here to the waterfall. I do like that this focuses more on the waterfall and that you have the bridge there, but it's just, there's a lot of sky here, and it wasn't really a brilliant sky this morning for the sunrise. So I thought this would be a good composition to save for later for Luminar AI, just to see what its sky replacement can do. Given how many tree branches there are, I'm a little bit skeptical that it'll be able to properly replace the sky, especially down here where I've already seen that it doesn't work that well under bridges. But yeah, so I'm not going to choose to edit those photos today. I'm going to stick more with, I think, this, not this composition, but this one right here. Because I think it's got, the bridge kind of goes a little bit right down the center of the frame here, so it doesn't really follow the, quote, rule of thirds, end quote. But I think that you have an almost equal share of sky to water, which I like, as opposed to this shot where it just, to me, doesn't feel properly balanced. There's too much water without a lot going on and just not really enough sky. So I like this, and I'm going to try to work with this a little bit. So the first thing that I'm going to do, and I always do this first with all my photo edits, is I come down and I remove chromatic aberration and I enable lens corrections. And it should be noted, too, for people that are watching this who are unfamiliar with what I'm using, this is Adobe Lightroom. I also use Capture One and Luminar AI, but today I will be using Lightroom, which in the time that the pandemic has gone on, I noticed has had a facelift from what it used to be. And it honestly, I think, looks a lot better in the program, doesn't it? So right now I'm taking a look at my histogram up here, if you guys can see that. And you can see that we're a little high, maybe even clipping a little bit right here on the shadows. So I'm going to just try to bring up my exposure a little bit while I'm looking at the histogram to see what happens with my peaks. So I want you guys to pay close attention here now. You see the left peak and the right peak. So we're at 0.83 plus on the exposure right now. Now look, if I move further to the right, you can see that I'm starting to now clip the highlights, right? So we've fixed the shadows, but we're clipping on the highlights. So I'm going to leave it right around here, maybe at +7 or +0.7 rather, where we've just kind of taken a little bit off of our shadow clipping and we're not quite clipping on the highlights yet. But you can see that we still have quite a blown out sky here. So the question is, can we save it? I think we can. I'm going to pull down some whites. I'm going to pull down some highlights. And you can see that we do have a reasonable sky. We've also fixed our histogram a little bit, so now we can play around with that a little bit more. So I'm pulling a little bit of the shadows out just so you can kind of see what's going on in the background. I don't want it super dark like this because then that looks really weird in our photo. Because this is about how dark it was when we started, right? So I want you to be able to see detail, but I don't want you to be able to see too much detail where it looks weird. So we're just going to pull up a little bit of shadow to where it looks kind of like a natural scene, like what you would have seen if you were there, if you know what I mean, in that sense. So here is where we're at after going through our light slider. We have plus 1.24 stops added to our exposure. We took the highlights down 58. We added 20 to the shadows. We took the whites all the way down. And I generally like to have what I consider to be like really inky blacks in my photos. So I am going to just take a little bit down on the black. I mean, you can't go down too far, right? You can see that just looks bad. But just bringing the blacks down a little bit is something that I personally like to do. So the white balance, I think, is okay as is. Bring my shadows a little bit back down now that I'm looking at this again. But I always do play around a little bit. I don't usually pick any of the presets. I just take a look generally at the temperature slider and see if I feel like I'm a little cool or a little warm. Just changing a little bit there, just adding a little warmth is fine for me. Something I always come down and do is I remove all of the in Lightroom sharpening. If I want to sharpen an image, I will do that later in Photoshop. And I'm also going to take the color noise reduction all the way down. I just don't feel the need for I don't feel the need for Lightroom to do their in-app sharpening, because I can do that much better in Photoshop. And frankly, I don't even think that this is an image that needs to be sharpened. So we're going to come into the crop tool just so I can look at my horizon and make sure I feel like it is straight. And sometimes in a landscape photo, by the way, it can be hard to tell if your horizon is straight. But if you look right over here to the left, you can see that we can see a little bit of the horizon line. So when I'm doing my straightening, that is what I'm looking at there. And I think that is about as straight as I'm going to get it. Now, something that I haven't really done a whole lot in Lightroom is the healing brush, because I think that I can do healing much better in Photoshop. So I always skip this step in Lightroom. And these menus have changed a little bit with the Lightroom facelift. So I'm trying to find where, I think this should be it, right? My gradient filter. Yeah. Okay, so let's take the exposure down a little bit. Let's maybe do a little bit in the highlights here as well. Maybe a little bit in the blacks. So before, what I was doing were global adjustments to the entire image. And now what I'm trying to do are some more focal adjustments specifically to the sky. And keep in mind, guys, when you're editing a photo, you don't always have to do global adjustments to everything. That is just something that I start out with. And then I usually will end with my focal adjustments. So right now I'm just playing around with this graduated neutral density filter. You can see as I bring it down, what we're doing is we're darkening the part of the photo that we're on, right? So you can see I've darkened the sky. Now we're coming down to the middle of the photo. The bottom is still untouched. Now we're coming down to the bottom, and look at how dark everything has become, right? Look at that. But we don't want that. That doesn't look good, does it? No. But this up here is adding a little bit more to this image, I think. That was a mistake. Control Z to undo that. So I am not the happiest camper with this image overall, right? It is not the best sunset or not the best sunrise that's ever occurred. And it's clearly an okay scene, but there's a lot in the background of this image that I'm not super thrilled with. But as far as our Lightroom adjustments go, can I still do Y for before and after? Nope, I can't. How do you do before and after now? Show original \. Is there show candidate and show select? Okay, well, we're just going to do the backslash. So that's where we started, and that's where we are now. So you can see that we've turned it from something where there are quite a bit of shadows in the middle of the scene to something that looks a lot more realistic, like what you would have actually seen had you been standing there next to me. Of course, you wouldn't have seen the water blurred like this, but, well, those are one of the few things that we can do in camera to make an image look very cool. So that is my Lightroom edit on this, guys, and I am going to bring this into Photoshop, and I'm bringing this into Luminar and see if I'm going to do anything with it there. Okay, guys, I have got this photo exported from Lightroom into Photoshop now via the simple right-click edit in Photoshop. And generally, when I come into Photoshop, what I do is I come to the Nik Collection, and I usually go into Color Efex Pro. Define is also good for noise reduction, and I will do that first just to see if we have any noise that needs to be removed. Looks to me like this is a fairly noise-free image, so no need to use something that we don't need to use, right? So back to Filter Nik Collection, Color Efex Pro, we're going to look at tonal contrast and pro contrast in here. And this is also the updated Nik Collection. I was used to using Nik Collection 1, and I had to buy Nik Collection 3 because it Nik Collection 1 doesn't work with the current version of Photoshop that I have, I guess. And okay, here we go, filter library. All right, so let's go to pro contrast first. So the first thing I like to do with any slider is just to go to extremes to see what it does to my image, and color cast correction here looks to be just making our image more cool. So maybe we'll just correct a little bit. Correct contrast, you can see that is terrible at high levels. At low levels, I'm not really sure that it is doing a lot for our image here. Dynamic contrast at high levels will look ridiculous, but at lower levels is not terrible. Then you can also add control points here as well. So if you wanted to do something local to the sky instead of generalized to the whole image, you can do that as well. So let's go ahead and add that in. Back to Filter Nik Collection, Color Efex Pro again. We're going to go to tonal contrast this time. Problem with tonal contrast is for some reason it always has these values baked into it. So we come over here and reduce them all to 0 so we can start from scratch. And then again, I always do this just to see what the extremes are. You're also generally not going to need very high values when you're working with tonal contrast. Like you can see right here, I'm at 8%. So let's take a look at what it was before we applied that and after. And you can see it's just added a little bit more definition into the water and in the sky, which I kind of like. I think that's a fair addition to our image, and it isn't really making it look too over-processed. So I can tell you guys right now, this is definitely not my favorite image I've taken, or even close to my favorite image, nor is it my favorite long exposure image. So let's come back here and we'll look at what this was before we did our Nik Collection and after. So before and after. But, you know, for driving 30 minutes from your house and trying to find something that you can get a reasonable long exposure from, it's not bad. Now, there is a lot that we could do to this image if we wanted to. For example, you can see that there are some sticks that are coming out right here from the waterfall. And, you know, if we really wanted to, we could come in and remove those. So, like, you know, we could do that, take out the stick a little bit, right? So yeah, that's kind of where we're at right now. I think I'm going to do one more Nik Collection layer just to see what it would look like if we did some local editing to the sky here with the control points. So I'm going to come back into Pro Contrast. Go to Control Points. We're just going to add some control points and adjust their size. So in here we can see with our control points what we are actually selecting versus not selecting. I'm selecting each one individually so you can see how those kind of change the image a little bit. So let's just go to correct color cast. No, we're good. Correct contrast. Don't want that. Dynamic contrast. I do like a little bit more dynamic contrast in the sky, but the before and after isn't really looking too extreme yet. Not even sure if that's noticeable at these levels. Okay, so we're going to go into tonal contrast now. Again, we have to take all of these pre-baked in values and go down. Going to go through the same step, but you guys, through the magic of editing, won't have to see me do all of these control points like I'll have to see myself do. Okay, so here's our control point mask. Maybe add a little bit of midtones to our sky. So our before and after is very minimal. You can see this here, right? This is our before and this is our after, but it does add just a little bit more depth to the clouds with those added highlights. And you got to keep in mind, guys, when we're doing this post-processing here, we're not really looking to change the image from what it factually was. We're just trying to make it look as nice as we can while having it be a somewhat reasonably factual representation of what we as photographers remember seeing while we were at the scene. And to me, this image is fairly true to that. So here are our Lightroom adjustments, and then adding on our Nik collection, we have this. So we have our before and our after. Our before and our after. And again, there are some things here that could be done to spruce up this image a little bit more. For example, we could add a layer of 50% gray, and we could just do a little bit of dodging here to maybe make that a little bit darker, dodge a little bit down here. But I don't feel like for this image, we really need to dodge or burn anything. So we're going to call this good. And this is the final result of my 30-minute drive this morning to try to take a photo near my house. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. And if you have any suggestions for any upcoming videos, please feel free to let me know, as I would like to put on content that you guys are into. So thanks for tuning in. And until next time, I will see you guys later.